Hi, my name is Diane Vogel Ferri. I am here to talk about my new book, No Life But This, a novel of Emily Roebling. I'm a lifelong Clevelander, East Sider, but I'm often in Lakewood because my daughter lives there and loves it. I grew up in Mayfield Village, went to Kent State, Cleveland State, and I taught children with special needs for 30 years. So thank you for inviting me to talk about my book. It's published by Atbosh Media, which is also a local Cleveland company, so you're supporting two local endeavors. The way I came to write this book was in 2018. I was getting ready to take a trip to the New York City area, and my friends and I were going to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, which had been a big dream of mine. And in preparing for that, I started reading about the Brooklyn Bridge, and I came across the name of Emily Roebling as a woman who was instrumental in building the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, this was back in the mid to late 19th century, so this was actually the 1860s. So it was quite remarkable, and I started looking for information about her and could find very little. I mean, she was a well-known figure, but really there was not very much about her life. And so I started looking for that, and I came across this remarkable woman's story and decided to write a book about her. So it's biographical and historical fiction, which means it's based on the life of a real person, but of course it's fictionalized. I did stay as close to the facts as possible through a lot of research. It's also a very historically rich time in our country. There are characters in the book that you'll recognize, like Thomas Edison and Henry Ward Beecher and Susan B. Anthony, and they are largely in their real capacity in the book. So the story begins in 1869, and Emily Roebling's father-in-law was John Roebling, and John Roebling was a well-known and successful bridge builder. There's a Roebling Bridge in Cincinnati, and he designed and was the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, which had not begun to be constructed yet. He died suddenly in an accident, and his son, Washington Roebling, who was Emily's husband, became the chief engineer. He was capable, he was an engineer, and he wanted to fulfill his father's dream. So he became the chief engineer, and their lives changed dramatically. They began to build what are called caissons, and caissons are structures with compressed air so that the workers could go down under the water all the way to the bedrock of the East River in New York to start building the first tower for the bridge on the Brooklyn side. Often the men came up very sick, and sometimes at a later point, some of them died from what is known as caisson disease or compression disease, or we might even know it as the bends. And Washington stayed down too long in one of the caissons and came up almost paralyzed. From that point, he was able to direct and be the engineer of the bridge from his bedroom window. They lived so close to the building of the Brooklyn Tower that he was able to direct what was going on from there. This is where Emily came in. She was an educated woman for that time period. She came from a well-to-do family and was apparently very gifted in math and science, and she understood the engineering of the bridge. They had gone to Germany together to study it, and so she became the liaison between the workers at the bridge and her husband, directing what should go on. And of course, she was not always taken seriously, was not believed that she really understood what she was talking about, but she did. And so she faced some of those indignities that women face then and even today sometimes of not being taken seriously or not given credit for what they could do. I'd like to read a little excerpt from chapter 3, and I'm just going to bounce around and make it short, but just to give you an idea of Emily's voice. I also wanted to say that the first half of the book is about the bridge. The second half of the book is about Emily's life after the bridge. So the part about the bridge is very factual. I used a wonderful book called The Great Bridge by David McCullough, who is a prolific writer of American history in our country. And I used that as the basis for all the information about the actual building of the bridge. So at this point in the chapter, there are men in the Roebling's parlor, and they are very skeptical about building these caissons because they were not familiar with them. And the book is in first person, so you're hearing Emily's voice. She says, "I pushed my ear against the closed parlor door, proud in the certainty with which my husband worked to convince the skeptical men of his father's plan. The discussion went on for some time, and although I am not the type of woman to rush in to wait on men, I took some fresh lemonade into the parlor so I could hear more." Later on, she says, "Gentlemen, let me assure you that my husband knows what he's talking about. I was with him in Europe during the 2 years. I believe, Mrs. Roebling, that was when you were giving birth to your son, was it not?" Mr. McLaughlin interrupted me. "Yes, but I am well aware of the efforts of my husband to learn all he could about the caissons, childbirth notwithstanding." "What exactly does that have to do with it?" I was incensed, but as usual, Washington tempered the discussion by confirming my words and my worth. My wife did indeed follow all I learned with great interest, and I never sensed that she was unable to understand the engineering involved. She has a keen mathematical mind. We were there for 2 years. Childbirth took but a day. He smiled at me. That shut Mr. McLaughlin's mouth for a while. "I apologize, Mrs. Roebling. No insult was intended. I'll leave you all to your work. I do have a child to care for after all," I added, somewhat unnecessarily. I left the room, closed the door, and kept listening. Then later on, she can't help it, she enters the room again, and she says, "I could see that they were dismayed to see me once again. Mrs. Roebling?" Mr. McLaughlin nodded demurely to me, as if to repair the earlier insult. "Mr. McLaughlin," I nodded back. "It may not be to your liking, but I have participated in this project from its inception. My edification concerning the caissons continued for the entire 2 years that we lived in Germany while my husband was studying. I am an educated woman, and I have extensive knowledge of math and the sciences." The men stood speechless. Wash put his arm through mine, as if to validate my statement. He patted my arm too, signaling for me to remain calm. At the end of the chapter, she is lying in bed at night and reflecting on her childhood, how she was a girl who was not interested in dolls and fairy tales, but in nature and the world around her. And she says, "Lying awake far into the night, I thought about Wash's hand on my arm, patting me into calm submission, and wondered whether anyone would do that to a man." So that gives you a little taste of Emily. She was a very driven woman, very ambitious, wanted to be known in her own right. And so, as I said, the second part of the book, book 2, is after the bridge. And it's all about Emily's accomplishments, which are all real, all true, and probably would be unbelievable if they weren't true. She was a feminist. She wrote books. She went to law school. She traveled the world speaking about women's rights. She traveled to Europe, met the Queen of England. She joined many women's organizations, and always tried to rise to the top of the organization. She liked being in charge. I had Kirkus review of my book, which Kirkus Review are one of the premier book reviewers in the country, and they said this book was a sensitive and comprehensive exploration of an exceptional historical figure. And I appreciated that very much. So you can find the book in your library, and if you want to purchase it at Amazon or in local bookstores, Barnes & Noble, it's No Life But This, and the title is taken from an Emily Dickinson poem, which you'll find a part of in the book, a novel of Emily Roebling. I thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity of talking about my book.